Who's your favorite director? Or who's your favorite musical artist? No, these aren't icebreakers or questions on a bad first date. These are questions that show us how important style is to how we feel about things. When you imagine the answer to these questions for yourself, do you imagine someone that you admire simply because they made a movie or simply because they put out an album that you like? It's probably something more than that. It's maybe difficult to articulate what exactly it is about that person. Maybe you can make comparisons to other artists or other directors and show why you prefer one to the other. But there's a certain je ne sais quoi, something that you don't quite know about their style that's difficult to articulate, that is what you really admire and what you're drawn to. When it comes to speaking, something similar also applies. Your style is not going to be completely confined to an idea about style that already exists. Nevertheless, the tradition of rhetoric thought deeply about style and recognized that when it came to speaking, there were certain basic principles that were effective for producing effects. In this short lecture, I'm not going to try to tell you how to be stylish, but just to give you some of those points to look for of where style might form. The first, and maybe not the most important, but one of the most ubiquitous elements of style for speech is repetition. Now, the thing that we don't want is for our audience to perceive us as being repetitive. But maybe it'll be clear when we start to talk about some aspects of repetition. So let's say we wanted to repeat sounds. Sounds that sound the same and slither off the tongue. So something like alliteration, which maybe you're familiar with. The repetition of sounds at the beginning of a word. Or consonants or assonants, the repetition of a certain kind of vowel sound that keeps the mouth open. That can be recognized as a place where someone's making a choice. I would say repetition at the level of sound in a speech often will elevate it to a register that maybe is literary, and maybe that's not always appropriate. But there are other forms of repetition that often are appropriate and can be very effective in the kinds of speech that we've been working on. Do you want a future? Do you want a future for your children? Do you want a future for your children that is better than our present moment? Then we must feel the urgency of that future now. This kind of rhetorical effect is called anaphora. It's when we use the same words at the beginning of a phrase in a repeated sequence. Often, it comes in threes. And this particular effect is called tricolon, where the first one is short, and then each one successively gets longer. But what's the point of this effect? Well, in the example that I just gave, which is one that I just made up, and you can find many others in famous speeches. We will fight them on the beaches, or I have a dream. This is often a moment of an intensification of a call to justice, a call to freedom, a call to fight. It's one of the most emphatic kinds of rhetorical gestures that one can make. Don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Here we can see the repetition follows an A, B, B, A format. And this famous line from John F. Kennedy, whatever the wisdom of it may be, is very memorable. And it has that kind of memorable quality largely because of the stylistic effect of the chiasmus. Chiasma, which is the plural, are maybe sometimes overused and abused, but they often give the effect of something that feels wise or insightful. And I think that might be a place to think about repetition that will be memorable but will feel like a takeaway. Another thing that repetition can do is give us a sense that ideas belong together. Here's a famous example from American rhetoric. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Really, if we broke down each one of those ideas, it's possible to support them independently, and maybe not to support all of them at once. You might say, yeah, I believe in rule for the people, but maybe we need to have experts in charge in order to direct things that are so complicated. Really, should we have a layperson running this? might be a political position that someone has. But these figures of repetition don't always have to rely upon using the same word. You might simply repeat the idea in other words and use it to amplify the intensity of that particular idea. Another category of stylistic effects has to do with the question of who is speaking. Of course, the obvious answer is it's me. And we often don't really want to throw people off of that. We don't want them to think that we're a shill, that we're speaking because someone paid us to, or something like that. But there are often times where we might want to play with that sense in an artistic way, a stylistic way, that gives people a different sense of who might be speaking or who might be being addressed. So one of these choices is called prosopopeia. This is when we actively take on another persona and speak through that. What are the situations in which you might want to do that? This might be maybe when someone can't speak for themselves. Maybe you might think of the Lorax from Dr. Seuss, who speaks for the trees. What would the trees say in this situation if we could listen to them? Or maybe you are working for animal rights or doing some kind of advocacy for animals. What would an animal say in this particular situation that you want your audience to imagine? Now, of course, there's a way that that can become melodramatic and maudlin and overly emotional in a bad way. But sometimes that can be really effective if done well. Another choice that might be made is apostrophe. This is when we address an audience that's not there. Or, in our case, no audience is physically there, but we address an audience that's different than the one that we normally address. This would be the case of saying, well, what would I say to this person if they were here in the room today? What would I say to someone who has meant so much to me? What would I say to this person who has wronged me or wronged us? What would we as a collective want to say to them now? Here's what I think we should say. And you would address them in those terms. Or you might be addressing a kind of imaginary class of people. How would we speak to the future? I want to talk to the future right now. Or I want to talk to our ancestors. Something like that can become very powerful and very moving. It's a stylistic choice that opens up possibilities of speech that we don't get when we only imagine speaking directly in the real moment that we're speaking to the real audience that's hearing our speech. Of course, there are other more obvious versions of this. We might quote someone and bring in their speech and represent it as the speech of another person. Or we might allude to something without totally marking it as the speech of another person. We might use the style and kind of ironize our own speech. We might speak like a preacher, or we might speak like a newspaper or a professor as a kind of parody. These are all stylistic choices that you might make in order to bring your audience closer to your position by showing them your awareness of other possible positions that exist from which you could speak but are not speaking. Finally, there are some figures and tropes that help to deal with what I'm going to call questions of representation. Oftentimes when we want to represent a sense of the world, we might first go to facts and figures in the statistical sense. But there are some things that are difficult to represent that way. How do we represent what things mean to people in terms of their emotional significance or historical significance? How do we represent something that's really complicated and maybe isn't easily measurable? We might go to what are sometimes called the four master tropes of rhetoric. The four are metaphor, synecdoche, metonymy, and irony, which I touched on already. First, let's think about metaphor. Let's say we wanted to talk about who we are as a community, who we are as an audience. Every speech has to form some sense of a we. But as you know from doing these speeches, the we is pretty vague. Who's really seeing your video, who your audience really is not obvious. And this is one of the powerful effects that metaphor can bring to a speech. How do we imagine ourselves is often a metaphorical endeavor. So let's say we are talking about a national community. All national communities are imagined communities, as the scholar Benedict Anderson argued in a famous book. You don't meet everybody in a nation. If you could, it really isn't much of a nation. It's a little small. It's more like a neighborhood, maybe. And probably in your neighborhoods, you don't meet everyone either. So when we're imagining something like a nation, what are the metaphors we might go to? Some people might say a nation is like a family. Some people might say that a nation is something that shares an ancestral history. Some people might talk about the nation as people that share a future. Each of these metaphors changes the dimensions of what is relevant in terms of the values and the actions and attitudes that community might participate in. So in choosing a metaphor for your audience, let's say, or really anything in your speech, you might think about those difficulties of representing collectivities that are abstract but nevertheless essential. Sometimes the thing that's difficult to represent is difficult because it's familiar, but its meaning is very subjective or indeterminate. This is sometimes why we might use something like metonymy. So let's say we want to talk about pain and suffering. Pain and suffering in a community is not experienced often or exclusively as a communal pain. People who are suffering from lead poisoning don't all experience it directly. So we have to represent this in some way. Therefore, we might talk about this through metonymy. Metonymy takes an associated idea, an associated concept with something, and makes that the object. It makes it stand in for the main thing that we're talking about. A pretty common version of metonymy for suffering and pain are tears. We talk about the tears of our children, something like that. Well, again, that can be kind of maudlin, that can be sentimental. What could be other things that are associated with pain? We could be thinking about maybe the loss of movement, the loss of ability. You can think about lost years, something like that. Metonymy brushes into metaphor pretty easily, but you can think metonymically by discovering those problems of representation where there's a huge amount of association in your audience with this idea, but not a very clear or definite reference point. Sometimes we want representation to be more focused, maybe because the form of representations which are habitually available to us have kind of run out of juice. I'll give you a very simple one that we often use, but maybe don't really think about why we use. People might talk about what their eyes have seen. So synecdoche points to a part of something as if it represents the whole. These eyes, my own eyes, have seen it, is maybe more powerful or more effective than saying, I saw it. Because we use the metaphor of seeing for so many things. I saw it doesn't have the same kind of emphatic effect as saying, these eyes have seen. So you might think about synecdoche representing the part for the whole at those moments where the so-called whole has almost too many associations. It's become kind of bland in what people understand by it. So by choosing and selecting some element of it, you might intensify the effect. And finally, irony. Irony is famously difficult to understand as an abstract concept, but it's also very familiar to us from everyday life. Ironic things are any moment where we can sense that the meaning is different than what might be expected or different from what might be intended, that within the thing that we're talking about, there's some kind of tension or distance. Why might you use irony? Well, there's lots of reasons. Sometimes it might be because expressing the thing that you want to express is impossible in the means of expression that you currently have. So you say almost the opposite of what you want to say. Yeah, things are going great in the world. And that can be kind of sardonic or sarcastic. That's a very kind of flat level of irony, but it's very familiar to us. We use it all the time in order to show a relationship to an audience that we're speaking to, that they're kind of in on the joke, that we see the things the same way, that of course you couldn't understand that in a straightforward manner. But there are other uses of irony that don't have to be maybe so flippant or glib, but might still be humorous. They might point to the juxtapositions of things in our world that seem out of place. It's the moment of style, even though style is often about what goes with what, that points to the lack of that fit in the world. So sometimes people will point out the fact that people who work at a hospital might come outside and smoke in front of the hospital on a break and be like, isn't that ironic? Well, maybe or maybe not. It really depends on the context that we're framing those ideas in, where we're seeing smoking as definitely unhealthy, and we're seeing what happens in a hospital as definitely healthy. But we can also reframe that. A lot of what goes on in the hospital is not really about health, it's about disease. So we could see these as being more continuous. You might think about, in your particular issue, moments where you want the audience to see something as being odd or extreme, or you might want them to feel indignation, or you might want them to feel surprise or humor, and you might point to the juxtaposition of elements in the world that shouldn't obviously go together. This is an inadequate and an overly brief version of what goes into the elements of rhetorical style. But hopefully it will give you a sense of just some of the creative powers that are available to you just from the expressiveness of verbal language itself. We could spend our whole lives studying the stylistic possibilities of language and not get to the end of it. One thing that might lead us to is something like literature or poetry. But at the same time, I would caution you in your speeches, while you're thinking about style, not to try to be too literary. We don't want something to sound like we're reading a short story to our audience or we're delivering a poem. The style of speech needs to remain oral. It needs to feel like it's something that's being spoken in the current moment to an audience who is supposed to be receiving it. So you do want to think about style, but you don't want to base your ideas of style off of a written vision of style. Hopefully this video has been helpful in bringing to mind some of the creative possibilities that might help polish that final version of your speech. But ultimately, you'll have to use your own judgment about the style that will work for you. And you have your own style. I'll end on one last note relevant to your personal style. When I was very young, I was really interested in cartooning. I wanted to be a cartoonist when I grew up. It didn't work out. I ended up being a professor instead. I was watching the show on television, and the guy looked into the camera and said, "Do you have trouble drawing hands?" "Yes, I did." "Why don't you try drawing characters without hands?" he said. And this appeared to me at the time when I was 7 as a revelation. I could choose the things that I didn't feel I was strong at in cartooning and make them choices. Oftentimes, I think the most powerful speakers, people that are most effective, aren't those that are perfectly polished in every sense. They're the people who understand their own strengths and weaknesses and choose them. They stylize the things that they're good at, but also the things that maybe they are not capable of doing, and just make them choices.